Hello, my dear friends. Not only did they sell their bodies, but they also lived in unimaginable filth. Beds were wet with blood and fluids, clothes went unwashed for weeks, and cleaning supplies were passed from girl to girl. What we thought was the most private of matters turned into a smelly and dangerous habit. Inside a Victorian brothel, the truth about personal hygiene was both shocking and chilling. Tonight, you will join me in entering that world to see for yourself what history often keeps hidden. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If one entered a Victorian brothel, the bed would be the first object to reveal the truth of the place. Mattresses were never dry. They carried layers of dampness left behind by countless bodies. Sweat soaked through the cloth and was joined by semen, urine, menstrual blood, and sometimes vomit. The stuffing absorbed everything and gave it back in the form of a heavy smell that lingered in the air. Even when fresh sheets were thrown on top, the stench rose through. The women lay down upon the same surface every night, forced to ignore the dampness because work demanded it. Sheets were not washed with care. At best, a sheet was shaken out of a window or across a stairwell. Dust and odours floated away for a moment, but the stains remained. Soap and clean water were not wasted on such work. A sheet that started as white soon carried layers of yellow and brown patches. The marks grew darker as weeks passed. Fabric that should have been changed after a single night instead covered dozens of bodies. Clients, half drunk, rarely noticed. The women noticed but had no choice. It is almost amusing in a bitter way that such filth was considered normal, as if a few shakes of fabric could erase what was already soaked deep inside. The mattresses sagged under the weight of years. Some were patched with straw, others carried lumps where the stuffing shifted. When a man fell across one, dampness pressed out from inside, as if the bed itself remembered everyone who had used it. The women stretched across those damp hollows and tried to focus on survival rather than comfort. There was no comfort. Every mattress was an archive of disease, yet it was treated as if it could serve forever. In the dim light of oil lamps, stains blended into shadow, but the smell always betrayed the truth. A sour mix of sweat, alcohol, and fluids clung to the room. When the windows were opened, the smell reached the street. Neighbours knew what happened inside, even if they pretended not to. The air inside was heavy enough to make breathing slow. Those who stayed too long grew used to it until their sense of smell dulled. For new arrivals, the shock was sharp. Some clients vomited after drinking too much gin or ale. The vomit soaked straight into the mattress, leaving a patch that stayed wet for days. Nobody stopped using the bed. Another man would arrive. The woman would lie down again, and the stain would flatten beneath them. The act continued as if nothing had happened. There was no pause, no cleaning, no thought of health. Work had to go on. Brothel keepers cared little for hygiene. Profit was what mattered. Replacing mattresses or paying for washing meant less money. The women were not asked about their comfort. Their task was to keep working, no matter what state the furniture was in. For them, a clean bed was a dream they never touched. Dirt became the background of life. If we compare this to today, it would be like entering a cheap motel where every bed carried weeks of unwashed sheets and still being told it was good enough to rent. The women learned to live with the smell on their bodies. When they rose from the bed, their skin carried the damp scent of what had been left behind. They wiped themselves quickly and pulled clothing back on. There was no chance to wash before the next client. In this way, filth passed from mattress to woman and from woman to client. Illness spread silently in the shadows, while the bed remained the same. The thin walls of the rooms meant that sound carried from one bed to another, but so did smell. One mattress pressed against the next, with little space between. A hallway might carry a dozen rooms, each with its own stench of wet bedding. The combined air was almost unbearable for someone unused to it. For the women, it was simply their workplace. Some beds had lice or fleas hidden in the stuffing. These bit the women at night, leaving welts that turned red and sore. The insects thrived in the damp material. No one bothered to burn or replace the mattresses. Instead, the women scratched their skin until it bled and then lay back down again. This cycle never ended. I cannot help but feel uneasy when picturing the women forced to return again and again to the same damp and stained surface, knowing there was no escape from it. The idea of privacy was meaningless. Once a man left, another came quickly. A woman barely had time to sit up before being told to lie back down. The sheet was pulled roughly into place, and the work resumed. The damp mattress never had time to dry. Nights turned into mornings, mornings turned into nights, and the same bed carried dozens of strangers. The women adapted in small ways. Some spread extra fabric between themselves and the worst stains, though this fabric was rarely clean either. Others tried to ignore the smell by drinking before working. Numbness became survival. To care about the state of the bed was to suffer more, and they already suffered enough. There was no inspection, no rule, no official who would demand better conditions. Brothels were tolerated but not protected. The women existed in the shadows of society, so their bedding could rot without consequence. Clients came for their pleasure and left without thought. The women stayed behind with the filth. The bed became both their workplace and their prison. Every woman knew its smell and weight. Every woman carried traces of it on her skin. It followed them out of the brothel into the alleys and markets. They lived within the shadow of these damp mattresses, marked by the beds that were never dry. The truth of the Victorian brothel lay not only in the faces of the women, but also in the furniture that supported them. Each mattress was a record of neglect. Each sheet was a reminder of poverty and disease. For those who entered the room, it was a momentary act. For the women, it was daily life. The mattress was never replaced. The sheet was never clean. The smell was never gone. The beds were never clean. The woman lay on stains that could never be hidden. Worse still, their own bodies had to match the same filth in order to be accepted. Cleanliness inside a Victorian brothel was not praised. It was distrusted. A woman who looked freshly washed or carried the scent of soap was marked as out of place. Clients did not come for the illusion of refinement. They wanted the smell of sweat, the proof of use, the familiarity of flesh that had already been handled many times before. A body without odour was considered false, a sign of inexperience. The men who paid wanted what seemed real to them, and in that world, real meant dirty. New arrivals quickly learned this lesson. A girl who entered with combed hair and skin scrubbed free of grime was given no credit for effort. She was told that clients would not believe her worth until she'd made herself less presentable. Days passed without bathing. Clothes were worn until they carried sweat marks. Sometimes, soot or dust was rubbed onto skin. The smell became a disguise, proof that she had belonged long enough to be accepted. It is almost laughable that filth was treated like a certificate of skill, while cleanliness could ruin a woman's chance to work. The neighbourhood surrounding the brothels helped reinforce this standard. In the poorest streets, the smell of waste, rotting food, and stagnant water hung over every corner. To blend in was to let those smells cling. If a woman walked through with a fresh scent, she drew too much attention. That attention was not the kind she needed. Clients sought the comfort of what they already knew. They wanted to step inside a room and smell the same odour they associated with desire. Any change felt wrong, even threatening. For the women, this meant shaping themselves to the environment. Soap was a luxury and often avoided, even when it was available. Hair was tied back, unwashed. Dresses stiff with sweat were worn again and again. The staleness of the garment served as part of the trade. When a client touched the fabric, it carried the heat and dampness of days past. To him, that was reassurance. To her, it was submission. In some places, women rubbed old perfume mixed with dirt into their bodies to create an even stronger impression. The perfume itself was cheap and often rancid. Combined with unwashed skin, it produced a sour, sweet stench that filled the room. The mixture worked in attracting clients who believed the smell was proof of passion. If we compare this to today, it would be like customers demanding that a restaurant keep its kitchen greasy and smelly, because spotless counters would make the food seem fake. Brothel keepers encouraged this practice. They told newcomers not to waste time trying to appear refined. They knew clients wanted something different. The image of cleanliness was linked to deception, while the smell of use was linked to authenticity. Women who ignored this rule often found themselves without customers. They had to choose between hunger and filth, and hunger was harder to bear. Over time, the women lost their own sense of what was normal. The smell of their skin, once offensive to them, became ordinary. They no longer noticed it. When they walked outside into cleaner streets, they felt exposed rather than relieved. Dirt had become protection. Filth had become identity. I find it unsettling to think of how quickly a human being could be forced to accept that her own body must stink in order to survive. In the crowded brothel rooms, this practice meant that odours grew even stronger. Each woman carried her own layer of sweat and unwashed clothing. Together, the smells mingled and filled every hallway. A newcomer entering the building for the first time might gag, but those who lived there no longer reacted. It was the mark of work done and work still waiting to be done. The men reinforced the cycle. They spoke of women who seemed too fresh, as if they were unnatural. They preferred the ones who smelled of long nights. In a world where there was no respect for the women themselves, their value became tied to how convincingly they could embody dirt. What should have been shame became routine. The brothel thus held its own code of belonging. To look clean was to invite suspicion. To look dirty was to earn trust. A paradox ruled the trade, and the women adapted because they had no power to resist. Poverty and hunger gave them no choice. They conformed because survival required it. The truth of these places lay not only in the stained beds, but also in the bodies forced to carry proof of neglect. Smell became an advertisement. Dirt became evidence. Without them, a woman was dismissed as new, false, or unworthy. With them, she belonged. Cleanliness was suspect. Dirt was acceptance. Smell was survival. Cleanliness was treated as a threat, while filth became the proof of experience. The women carried smells that turned into their only form of protection, yet the water they were forced to wash in was far worse than the dirt they tried to cover. A single basin often stood in the middle of the brothel, meant to serve all the women one after another. The water inside was rarely changed. By the time the first woman finished, the liquid was already cloudy. Soon it turned into a grey soup that carried bits of soap, flakes of dead skin, and strands of hair floating across the surface. It smelled of sweat and stale perfume, a mix that clung to everything it touched. The women still had to kneel around it, dipping cloths into the same filthy basin, because it was the only form of washing they were given. The practice was routine. One woman would wash her face or wipe her body, then another would take the same water and press it against her own skin. There was no thought of infection, not because they did not care, but because they had no choice. The water was a shared resource, just like the beds, just like the rooms, just like their very lives. It is almost comical in a dark way that something called washing could leave a woman dirtier than when she began. In this basin, all tasks were done at once. A woman rinsed her underclothes in the same liquid that another had used to clean herself. Feet were plunged in after cloths had been used for more private areas. Sometimes the basin held the remains of cheap soap, clumped and slippery, swirling together with sweat. The mixture spread across everybody, layer upon layer. The illusion of cleanliness was achieved only by moving water over the skin, but the water itself carried more filth than it removed. The smell of the basin grew worse the longer it stood. At the start of the day, it might seem only faintly sour. By evening, after many women had used it, the stench became sharp. It filled the room and drifted into the hallway. Anyone passing by could tell what was inside. Still, the basin remained because replacing the water required effort, and effort cost money. The women were expected to make do, no matter what floated in the liquid. Some women tried to push hair and skin flakes aside with their hands before dipping cloths again. It was a futile gesture. The particles returned quickly, sticking to fabric and clinging to the rim of the basin. Clients who looked in rarely cared. They wanted bodies that smelled faintly masked, not truly clean. To them, the act of washing mattered more than the result. If we compare this to today, it would be like dozens of strangers brushing their teeth with the same glass of water, each spitting back into it, and everyone pretending the rinse had made them fresh. The women often left the basin with irritated skin. Rash and redness spread where the water had rubbed. Cuts and sores became infected quickly. When undergarments were rinsed in the same water, the damp fabric carried bacteria back onto their bodies. This cycle repeated day after day, until illness became as common as hunger. A doctor would have shuddered at the sight, but doctors were never present in these rooms. The ritual of shared washing also stripped the women of dignity. To kneel together around a small basin, each waiting her turn, was a reminder that privacy did not exist. They leaned shoulder to shoulder, wiping themselves quickly, then giving space for the next. No one spoke of shame. Shame had no meaning in a place where even water was communal. I cannot help but feel disturbed imagining how something as simple as a basin became another tool that reduced their lives to bare survival. Some women attempted to scent the basin with drops of cheap perfume or alcohol. The additions only layered another smell on top of the rot. The liquid became sweet and sour at once, clinging to the skin more strongly. Yet the effort revealed a small wish to feel human again, even for a moment. But the moment ended as soon as the next cloth was dipped in. The basin itself was often chipped or cracked, its edges dark with grime that never washed away. It stood in the centre of the room like a permanent fixture, as much a part of the brothel as the beds. Women arrived, knelt, and left, repeating the same act without expectation of change. The object was not only a vessel for water, but also a symbol of the life they endured. Every woman knew that the basin carried risk. They felt it in the burning of their skin and the sores that followed. Yet they returned, because to refuse was to mark themselves as unwilling. Unwilling women did not last long in such places. Survival meant acceptance, even of water that carried sickness. The idea of bathing should have promised relief, a moment of renewal. Here, it was the opposite. It was simply another reminder that cleanliness was an illusion. The dirt remained, only rearranged. The smell remained, only mixed with perfume. The sickness remained, only passed from one body to another. In the silence after the last woman left the basin, the water sat still. The surface carried grease and hair, reflecting the dim light of the lamp. No one emptied it until morning, and sometimes not even then. By the next day, the same basin stood ready, and the cycle began again. The brothel basin was not just unclean. It was a vessel of disease, a mirror of neglect, and a routine so normalized that no one expected better. It was as there was to participate in a performance where the outcome was already known. The women were left carrying the residue of everyone else, their skin coated with the proof of shared survival. The basin was never fresh. The water was never safe. The act was never truly cleansing. The routine of washing together in filth was only one part of their struggle. Even when their own bodies bled with pain, they were denied rest. Infections were ignored. Illness was hidden, and work was forced to continue. Rags cut from old dresses or torn cloth served as the only form of protection during menstruation inside Victorian brothels. These scraps were folded and placed inside undergarments, meant to hold back the flow, but they were already worn thin from many uses. Once soaked, they were rinsed quickly in cold water, then hung by the stove or near a weak fire. They rarely dried fully before being put back on. The dampness pressed against skin, carrying the smell of iron and mould. Each woman knew the feeling of cloth that clung wet against her body, leaving her raw and sore. There was no privacy in this act. A corner of the room, or the space near the kitchen fire, became the place where rags were hung. Anyone walking past could see them, stiff with stains, fluttering faintly in the heat. They were not boiled, not scrubbed, not treated as items of hygiene. They were handled as cheaply as possible because there was no other choice. The women could not afford proper linen, and no one would provide it. The rags wore thin after many washes. Fibres came loose, edges frayed, and soon the cloth began to fall apart. Some women stitched pieces together with thread, though these repairs lasted only briefly. When no more fabric was available, the newspaper was crumpled and pressed into place. The paper quickly disintegrated when wet, leaving shreds against the skin and raising the risk of infection. It almost sounds absurd to imagine that something meant to protect women instead made them sicker with every use. The infections came often. The rags were soaked in blood, rinsed in dirty water, and returned damp to the body. Bacteria thrived. Women complained of itching, burning, and swelling, but such complaints were rarely spoken aloud. There was no break from work. Even on the heaviest days, they were forced to lie on the same stained mattresses, the rags slipping or leaking, leaving more marks on sheets that no one intended to wash. The smell betrayed them. Blood mixed with sweat and stale perfume created an odour that filled the room. Men pretended not to notice, though some complained, forcing the women to rinse more often. But the rinsing only repeated the cycle, since the same dirty basin served for everything. The damp cloth never had time to dry. It was worn again and again until it disintegrated. Some women cut strips from their only dresses to make new rags. The sacrifice left them with fewer garments to wear in the streets. Walking outside with patched or ragged clothing marked them further as poor and desperate. Yet they had little choice. Protection for their bodies mattered more in the moment than appearances, even if both were reminders of neglect. The environment of the brothel worsened the problem. Heat from lamps mixed with damp cloths to create a heavy, sour air. Rags dried stiff and brittle, only to be softened again by blood. Women shared the same corner to hang their clothes, so one rag often touched another. Infection spread without notice. No one cared to separate them. If we compare this to today, it would be like dozens of people forced to share the same medical bandage over and over, each adding their own wounds to the fabric. The women themselves lost awareness of what health felt like. Discomfort was constant. Pain was expected. A body free of burning or itching was rare, and when it happened, it felt unnatural. Over time, they came to accept that sores and swelling were simply part of life. What could have been prevented with clean fabric became a permanent state of suffering. I find it deeply troubling to think that something as natural as menstruation has become another weapon of hardship in their daily existence. The brothel keepers gave no support. They considered menstrual cycles an inconvenience but not a reason to stop work. Women who tried to rest risked punishment or dismissal. Some were forced to stuff extra cloth or paper into their garments to keep working. The stains on the sheets grew darker, but the work never stopped. Profit outweighed any thought of care. Blood was not treated as dangerous. It was treated as another stain on the mattress, another smell in the room, another layer in the endless cycle of filth. Men who came drunk often noticed only in passing, and those who did notice sometimes treated it as part of the act. For the women, it was humiliation layered on top of pain. The rags themselves became symbols of their place. They were poor. They were replaceable. They were forced to carry proof of their neglect. The scraps of fabric spoke louder than words. They told of bodies not valued, of needs not considered, of survival achieved only through reuse and infection, the routine did not change. A woman bled. She used the rag, she rinsed it in cold water, she hung it near the fire, and she wore it again, day after day, month after month, year after year. The cycle repeated. No doctor examined them, no official investigated, no reform touched these rooms. The rags grew thinner, the women grew weaker, the infections grew worse, and still the brothel demanded more. Even when their bodies cried out for rest, they were expected to keep moving. The rags were only one piece of the burden. Soon, attention would turn to the objects meant to prevent pregnancy. Tools reused so many times they became dangerous themselves. Contraception in Victorian brothels was neither safe nor private. The tools provided were scarce, and they were used again and again until they broke apart. A few sponges were distributed among many women. These sponges were placed inside the body, removed after use, rinsed quickly under cold water, and then passed on. No soap, no disinfectant, and no care were applied. They were returned to the same drawer and picked up again for the next client. The routine became normal, even though every woman understood the risk. The practice of using animal intestines as condoms was equally disturbing. Thin pieces of sheep gut were cleaned and tied into shape, then reused many times. After a client finished, the sheath was turned inside out, rinsed, hung to dry, and returned to circulation. 10 or more uses were common, each one carrying the traces of the person before. The material weakened with every stretch until holes appeared, but by then it had already been used on many women. It is almost ridiculous that something designed to protect was treated like a rag to be borrowed, rinsed, and handed back. The shortage of supplies was intentional. Brothel keepers controlled access to these tools, keeping only a few on hand for many women. 2 or 3 sponges, a handful of sheaths, and nothing more. Each woman had to wait her turn or make do with whatever was available. No one was allowed to own a personal supply. Control kept the women dependent, and dependence meant obedience. The condition of the tools worsened quickly. Sponges frayed, their surfaces torn and rough, bits of tissue stuck to them, soaked in fluids that rinsing never removed. Condoms made from intestines carried a permanent odour of damp flesh even when hung to dry. When a woman was told to use one, she had no choice but to obey. If we compare this to today, it would be like hospitals forcing dozens of patients to share the same single-use syringe, washing it briefly between injections, and pretending it was safe. Infection spread easily through these tools. Women complained of soreness and burning after use. Swelling followed, sometimes leading to abscesses. Pregnancy still occurred frequently because the tools were already damaged, but the risks did not matter to the brothel owners. As long as the clients paid, the women's health was irrelevant. For the women themselves, the tools were a constant reminder of their lack of control. They could not refuse to use them, and they could not demand better. Their bodies became sites where the same objects circulated again and again, each carrying another's trace. Some women tried to wash them more thoroughly in secret, but even this was limited by the lack of clean water or soap. Their efforts changed nothing in the long run. The sense of disgust became dulled over time. What shocked newcomers became routine for those who stayed longer. They grew used to the sight of sponges lined up on a windowsill, drying in the weak sunlight, each one meant to return to another body within hours. They accepted the smell of intestines hanging near the stove, pretending it was normal to see them waiting like strips of meat. I cannot help but feel horrified at the thought that these women were forced to treat dangerous scraps as ordinary tools of daily work. Pregnancies that resulted from failed contraception often led to even more desperate measures. Some women tried to use the same sponges soaked in vinegar or alcohol, believing it might prevent life from taking hold. The result was pain, bleeding, and further infection. The cycle of harm deepened, but no alternative existed. Poverty left them with nothing else. Clients rarely noticed or cared about the state of these tools. Their interest lasted only for the moments they paid for. The women were left to manage the consequences. Even when clients contracted infections themselves, blame never turned toward the system that forced everyone to share. Instead, it fell on the women, who were accused of spreading disease while denied the means to prevent it. The power imbalance could not have been clearer. Brothel keepers held the tools, rationed them, and ordered their use. The women obeyed because refusal meant hunger or the street. Objects that should have been private became shared property, shuffled between hands, between bodies, between nights. The illusion of protection hid a reality of constant danger. These practices stripped the idea of safety from the women entirely. They knew that each use might bring infection. They knew that pregnancies could still come. They knew that pain would follow. Yet they also knew that survival required silence. Complaints would not change anything. The sponge would still be rinsed. The sheath would still be turned inside out. The tools would still return to the drawer. The cycle was endless. A woman used the sponge, rinsed it, and returned it. Another used it hours later, rinsed it, and returned it again. The same motion was repeated until the sponge disintegrated. Then a new one was cut, and the routine continued. The intestines hung and dried, then were passed from hand to hand until they tore completely. By then, another batch would replace them. There was no protection. There was only the appearance of it. There was no safety. There was only the demand to keep working. There was no dignity. There was only survival inside neglect. The reused tools were not the only objects carrying disease. Even clothing was rarely washed, and worn until it stiffened with stains. The very fabric pressed against their skin became another breeding ground for infection. Clean tools did not exist. Shared sponges and intestines passed through every hand. The women's clothing carried the same neglect against their skin. Underwear inside Victorian brothels was rarely clean. Most women owned only a single pair, sometimes two if they were fortunate, and these garments were worn until they stiffened with stains. The fabric became yellow with sweat, streaked with dried blood, and coated with layers of discharge that never fully washed away. The smell was strong and sour, pressing into the body and then into the room around it. Changing daily was a luxury reserved for those with wealth. For women trapped in the brothels, survival meant reusing what was already dirty. When washing did occur, it was done in the simplest way possible. A bucket of dark water served as the laundry basin. Underwear was plunged in, rubbed briefly, and lifted out again, still holding stains that never disappeared. Soap was too costly, and water was rarely refreshed. The garments, damp and streaked, were then hung in the same dim rooms where the women slept. Without sunlight or fresh air, they never dried properly. The cloth remained wet at the seams, heavy with moisture, carrying the same filth back onto skin when worn again. It is almost darkly humorous to think that underwear was washed only enough to spread the dirt evenly, not to remove it. Clients did not wait for the laundry to dry. When the business called, women were forced to put the damp garments back on, the wet fabric pressed against delicate skin, rubbing until red marks appeared. Soon, the marks broke into rashes, and rashes became sores. Infection grew where the cloth stuck closest, spreading slowly across the thighs and waist. The women felt constant itching, burning, and pain, but there was no chance to rest or recover. The fabric itself grew weaker with time. Cotton or linen torn from older clothes was often stitched into underwear, and these pieces frayed quickly. Holes appeared, seams split, and threads hung loose. Some women patched them with whatever scraps were available. Others tied them in knots to hold the pieces together, yet no matter how worn, the garments continued to be used, because replacements cost more than they could pay. The appearance of the underwear betrayed the neglect. Once white or pale, it turned into shades of brown and yellow. Stiff patches marked where fluids had dried and set. Clients who noticed often ignored it, since they cared more about their own desire than the woman's condition. A few even treated the dirt as expected, proof that the women were truly part of the brothel life. If we compare this to today, it would be like office workers wearing the same unwashed socks for weeks, only rinsing them in dirty water, and then being told it was perfectly fine for professional appearance. The smell of these garments lingered in every room, hung on lines across the ceiling or laid across chairs. They filled the brothel with a sour air, mixed with sweat, perfume, and the odour of unwashed mattresses. The effect was overwhelming. New women gagged at first, but they grew accustomed. Their senses dulled, as did their expectations of anything better. Some women tried small tricks to ease the discomfort. They rubbed ash or chalk into the fabric to mask stains. Others sprinkled perfume into the bucket of water, hoping to change the smell. The results were poor, as the underlying filth always returned. These small efforts only proved how little control they had. They could not buy fresh garments, so they tried to disguise the decay. I cannot help but feel a quiet sadness thinking about how these women tried to fight despair with scraps of effort, knowing it would never truly work. The lack of clean underwear increased the spread of disease. Rashes became infected, sores grew into ulcers. Bacteria passed from one woman to another when laundry was shared in the same bucket. No one kept garments separate. Clothes touched each other, exchanging fluids as they soaked in the same dirty water. The brothel became a place where illness grew not only from contact with men but from the clothing women wore each day. The garments also symbolized control. Brothel keepers rarely allowed women to own more than the bare minimum. By limiting what they had, the owners made them easier to manage. Women had no reserves to fall back on. If a garment tore beyond repair, they depended on the keeper to provide another, often at an inflated cost that increased their debts. Clothing was not just fabric. It was another chain tying them to the brothel. For the women, the underwear became part of their identity, though never with pride. It marked them as workers in a place where dignity was stripped away. Each stain, each smell, each patch carried proof of what they endured. There was no chance to feel fresh or whole. Even when they stepped outside, the odour clung to them, a silent advertisement of their condition. Night after night, they wore the same pieces. Morning after morning, they rinsed them in dark water and hung them in dim rooms. The cycle repeated endlessly, the fabric weakened, the stains deepened, and the women grew more accustomed to the discomfort. Their skin broke under the weight of neglect, but they pressed forward because survival demanded it. Underwear was not replaced daily. It was not replaced weekly. For some, it was not replaced at all until it tore beyond repair. The garments were rotten. The water was foul. The skin beneath was left raw. And yet, this was not the worst practice forced on them. To increase their market value, some were made to bleach their most private parts with chemicals that burned their flesh. Brothel owners in Victorian times believed that lighter skin meant higher value. This idea was not limited to faces or hands, but forced upon the most private parts of a woman's body. They demanded that the women bleach their flesh to appear pale, as if this would make them more desirable to paying clients. The methods were crude and painful. Quicklime mixed with water was spread directly onto the skin. Borax powder was rubbed in as well. The chemicals burned, leaving blisters, sores, and scars. Yet women were ordered to continue, because refusal meant punishment or dismissal. The process was presented as a form of improvement, but it was nothing more than cruelty disguised as practice. Quicklime reacted harshly with delicate skin. Even when diluted, it caused a sharp stinging that turned into unbearable pain. Women clenched their teeth and endured it, knowing the alternative was hunger. The burns that followed left raw patches, sometimes oozing, sometimes peeling away in strips. It is almost bitterly amusing that a body was considered more attractive when covered in injuries caused by the very effort to make it appealing. Borax added another layer of harm. The powder was rubbed onto the same inflamed skin, scratching open wounds and spreading infection. Instead of making the area lighter, It often left dark scars or raw red flesh. Still, brothel keepers claimed it made the women worth more. They forced the women to repeat the process again and again, ignoring the injuries it created. Other home remedies were equally destructive. Lemons were cut, and the juice was squeezed onto already burning skin. Vinegar was poured as well, its acid soaking into every cut. Some even used ashes from burnt wood, believing the abrasion would scrub the skin lighter. The pain was sharp and unending. Women often cried silently through the process because showing resistance was dangerous. The results were not what anyone claimed. Instead of pale smoothness, the women ended up with sores and discoloration. The skin became rough, cracked, and sometimes permanently damaged. Infections spread quickly in such an environment. The irony was that men who came drunk hardly noticed the difference. The bleaching was done more for the image of the brothel than for the satisfaction of the clients. If we compare this to today, it would be like a workplace forcing employees to burn their own hands with chemicals every morning just to convince customers that their service looked cleaner. The damage from these treatments lingered long after. Women carried scars for life. Some developed chronic infections that never healed. Others lost sensation or suffered pain whenever they worked. There was no medical help. Doctors rarely entered brothels, and if they did, they looked the other way. The women learned to live with constant discomfort because complaining brought punishment. Brothel owners framed these treatments as investments. They spoke of women being more profitable once their skin was lighter. But the truth was that it was another method of control. By making women damage themselves, they reinforced dependence. Women who were scarred or in pain were less likely to leave, less able to find other work. The practice trapped them further inside the cycle. Some women attempted to resist by diluting the chemicals more than instructed, or by skipping applications. If discovered, they faced fines or worse. Others begged for mercy, but their words meant nothing. To the keepers, women were property. Property was shaped as the owner demanded, even if it meant harm. The tools of bleaching were kept in plain sight. Bowls of lime water, jars of vinegar, and packets of borax sat in corners of the brothel. They were used openly, as routine as drawing water or lighting lamps. No one considered it unusual. The normality of the cruelty was perhaps the most disturbing part. Over time, women became numb. The first burns brought tears, but after months or years, the pain became another constant. They lived with sores, bandaged with dirty cloths, and returned to work as if nothing had happened. Their bodies became maps of abuse, each scar telling a story no one cared to hear. I cannot help but feel an ache when imagining those women forced to treat wounds created by chemicals, only to prepare themselves for the same cycle again the next day. The bleaching did not raise their worth in reality. Clients did not pay more. The only ones who gained were the keepers, who convinced themselves that they had increased the appeal of their property. The women gained nothing but pain. The practice shows how little care was given to health, how appearance mattered more than survival. The women's bodies were seen not as human but as surfaces to be altered. If a surface was damaged, it was replaced, never healed. This attitude shaped every part of the brothel, from the beds to the basins to the clothes, and finally to the flesh itself. The bleaching was not about beauty. It was about control. It was about forcing women to accept pain as routine. It was about proving that their bodies did not belong to them. The chemicals burned, the scars deepened, the infection spread. Yet there was another hidden threat waiting above their heads. Hair, rarely washed and crawling with lice, carried its own kind of misery. Hair in Victorian brothels became a constant burden rather than a source of pride. Long strands that might have been combed or adorned in another life were instead crawling with lice. Small insects moved quickly across the scalp, leaving behind eggs that clung tightly to the roots. The white specks lined the hair like beads, impossible to remove without long hours of scraping. Lice spread easily from one woman to another, A shared pillow, a shared sheet, or a shared comb was enough. Soon, an entire room of women would be scratching their heads, their nails breaking the skin, leaving red tracks that bled and crusted. The combs they used were old and broken. Teeth were missing, and those that remained were clogged with hair and eggs. Passing a comb through thick hair pulled out more insects than tangles. The women winced as they did it, but there was no alternative. Once the lice had spread, they never left. The beds carried them, the clothes carried them, and the women carried them. Every night added more. It is almost bitterly funny that the only creatures guaranteed safety in a brothel were the lice, thriving no matter how many times women tried to kill them. Washing the hair happened rarely. Once a month was the most common pattern, and even then it was with cold water. Soap was made from ash or soda, rough and salty, burning the scalp rather than soothing it. The water was never clean, usually taken from the same basins or buckets used for other chores. Dirt floated on the surface before it touched their heads. The wash left them shivering, their scalps raw, and yet the lice remained. Washing did little to kill the insects. The relief lasted only as long as the hair was wet. Once it dried, the crawling returned. There were no chemical treatments, no medicines available to them. They relied on their hands. Women sat together, parting hair and pressing lice between their fingernails until the insects burst. The smell of crushed lice mixed with the sourness of unwashed bodies. Eggs were harder to deal with. Stuck tightly against the strands, they had to be scraped off one by one, a process that took hours and still never finished the task. Many gave up halfway, resigned to the idea that their heads would always itch. Some shaved their hair entirely. A razor was passed roughly across the scalp, leaving cuts that bled. The relief was temporary. Without hair, lice still clung to bedding and quickly returned once stubble grew. The women who shaved often felt humiliated. Long hair was still a sign of femininity, and losing it made them feel marked even more. Yet the constant torment of itching sometimes made shaving the only choice. The itching never stopped. Women scratched until their scalps broke open. Scabs formed and were torn away again. Blood smeared across pillows and collars. The scratching spread to the neck and shoulders, where lice travelled. Some nights, they could not sleep for the irritation. Clients often ignored it or treated it as part of the experience, pushing their hands into the same infested hair without care. If we compare this to today, it would be like an office where every worker shared one helmet lined with insects, passing it from head to head until everyone was scratching at their desks. The infestation spread beyond hair. Lice fell onto bedding, into underwear, and across the floorboards. They moved with ease in the crowded rooms. Women woke to find insects crawling across their bodies. Children born or kept in the brothels caught them as well, living with the same endless cycle. There was no escape in such close quarters. Once lice entered a place, they claimed it completely. The shame weighed heavily. In a society that valued appearances, these women were marked doubly. They were already judged for their work, and the visible scratching and sores marked them further. Some tried to cover their heads with scarves, hiding the signs of infestation, but the movement of their hands to their scalps gave it away. Clients joked crudely, and brothel keepers scolded, yet neither offered solutions. The combs themselves became weapons of infection. Passed from one woman to another, they spread eggs quickly, hair stuck to the teeth, clotted with grease and insects, and then dragged through another head. No one had her own comb. They were communal like everything else, and this meant everyone carried the same suffering. I cannot help but feel heavy knowing that even something as personal as a comb was denied to these women, turning relief into another source of pain. Infections on the scalp were common. Cuts from scratching became swollen, and pus gathered under the skin. Fever sometimes followed, leaving women weak but still forced to work. There was no break allowed. A woman with lice, bleeding sores, and fever still lay on the same mattresses, still combed her hair with the same infested tools. The daily rhythm was built around endurance. Women scratched, They pressed lice with their nails. They cursed silently, but they continued. Every task became harder under the constant distraction of itching. Yet brothel life allowed no pause. It demanded presence no matter the state of the body. The lice were never defeated. They survived every wash, every shaving, every attempt. They lived in cloth, in beds, in corners of wood. They multiplied in silence. For the women, the infestation became part of the background of existence, like the smell of unwashed sheets or the dampness of mattresses. It was simply there, another detail of neglect. Hair became not a source of beauty, but a prison of parasites. It framed faces drawn by exhaustion. It carried proof of suffering in every egg stuck to its strands. The women carried it with them into every room, into every encounter, and could not escape it. The hair was infested. The combs were shared. The itching was endless. Yet the torment of lice was only one layer of cruelty. Even more invasive punishments awaited, with blades taken to the most intimate parts, leaving pain and blood where hair once grew. The demand for hairless skin in Victorian brothels was cruelly enforced. Some women were ordered to shave their pubic hair every day, not for hygiene, but because brothel keepers believed it made them more appealing to clients. The act was carried out with the same razors used on many others, blades dulled and rusting from overuse. There was no sterilization, no attempt to make the process safe. The same edge that had scraped across one body was dragged across the next, carrying with it blood, bacteria, and disease. The razors were far from sharp. They caught on hair, tugging and tearing before cutting. Skin splits easily under their jagged edges. Women felt the sting immediately, followed by a slow burning as the cuts opened. Blood welled up in thin lines or drops, soaking into cloth already stained from countless earlier wounds. Still, they were told to continue. The routine was not optional. It is almost bitterly absurd that an act meant to make women appear more desirable left them with nothing but cuts and scars. After shaving, the pain worsened. Brothel keepers insisted on pouring alcohol or cheap perfume onto the wounds as a form of cleaning. The liquid burned sharply, searing into broken skin. Women clenched their teeth and endured, even though it offered no true protection. Infection followed regardless. Perfume carried its own irritants, spreading rash and swelling. Alcohol did little against the dirt of the rooms. The result was sores that never healed, reopened day after day by the return of the same rusty blade. The demand for hairlessness had nothing to do with safety or comfort. It was about control. Brothel owners wanted to present their women as different, shaped according to a false standard. Some clients expected this appearance, treating hair as a sign of dirtiness, though the reality was that shaving created far more filth. Cuts became open doors for disease. Viruses spread from one body to another. Growths and warts followed, painful and humiliating, but ignored in favour of continued work. The process stripped the women of dignity. To kneel in a corner and scrape themselves with the same blade used on another hour earlier was not only painful but degrading. No privacy was offered. Sometimes another woman helped, holding the skin taut to make the cut cleaner. This only spread the contamination further. Nothing about the ritual offered relief. Everything about it was humiliating. The razors themselves were handled carelessly. They were left on tables, rust forming at the edges. Sometimes they were wiped with a dirty cloth. Other times dipped quickly in water. Then they were used again, pressed against another woman's flesh. The cycle was endless. If we compare this to today, it would be like a barber using the same unwashed blade on dozens of customers, leaving each with bleeding cuts, and then calling it a professional service. The women bore the consequences. Cuts turned into sores. Sores turned into abscesses. Some became too swollen to sit comfortably, yet they were still forced to work. Others carried visible marks that made clients recoil, though they had been caused by the very practice demanded by the brothel. Those who refused to shave risked punishment, loss of income, or even eviction. Choice was an illusion. Over time, scars built up across their skin. Thin white lines marked places where the blade had cut too deeply. Dark patches showed where infection had once festered. The repeated irritation left the skin rough, far from the smooth appearance the owners wanted to sell. Yet the routine continued, because it was never about the actual result. It was about showing obedience. The physical suffering was matched by psychological weight. To know that the next day would bring the same razor, the same cuts, the same burning alcohol, left women drained before the act even began. They learned to numb themselves, to treat pain as background noise. The silence around them reinforced the cruelty. Everyone suffered, but no one was allowed to speak of it. Brothel keepers saw the practice as a mark of refinement. They claimed it raised the status of their establishment, setting them apart from cheaper houses. But this was a hollow claim. No real refinement existed in a place where women bled daily under rusted blades. It was a performance of luxury built on the bodies of those with no power to resist. I cannot help but feel disturbed imagining a room where dozens of women endured the same cuts in silence, knowing they had to present themselves as if nothing had happened. Disease followed naturally. Genital warts, infections, and sores spread rapidly among women and clients alike. But blame never fell on the razors. Instead, it was cast back onto the women, accused of being unclean even while being forced to shave until they bled. The cruelty lay not only in the act, but in the hypocrisy surrounding it. The cycle continued without change. Razors dulled further. Women endured more cuts. Infection deepened. Still, the practice was enforced. It was part of the system, part of the brothel's image, part of the control pressed onto everybody. There was no relief. There was no safety. There was only the scrape of rusted metal against raw flesh. The blades cut daily. The alcohol burned after. The infections spread endlessly. Yet beyond the wounds of shaving lay another silence. The mouths of these women, used again and again, were never given the care they needed. Their own voices were ignored, and even their mouths were left unclean after every man passed through. The mouths of women in Victorian brothels were used repeatedly without pause, yet no one thought to care for them. There was no time allowed between clients to rinse, no chance to brush, and no clean water set aside for relief. One man would leave, and another would arrive, expecting the same service. Whatever remained from the last encounter stayed in place, lingering in saliva and coating the tongue. The women swallowed what they could, wiped their lips, and carried on. The routine left no space for hygiene. Some tried to mask the odour with simple tricks. Dried herbs were chewed to release a faint scent. Mint leaves or cloves could be found cheaply in markets, but they offered only a thin disguise. The taste of alcohol or decay from previous clients remained, hidden beneath the surface. The herbs did nothing to kill the germs, which multiplied freely in the warm dampness of the mouth. It is almost bitterly comical that something as fragile as a mint leaf was treated as if it could wash away disease. Sores spread quickly under such conditions. Lips cracked and bled from constant friction. Ulcers formed inside the cheeks, stinging every time a woman tried to swallow. The tongue developed a thick white coating, a layer of bacteria mixed with rot. Gums swelled and bled, loosening teeth over time. These signs of infection were ignored, brushed aside by brothel keepers as minor problems. What mattered was whether the women could still work. As long as they could open their mouths, they were considered fit. Clients rarely noticed or cared. Many were drunk, their own mouths filled with smoke, alcohol, and decay. The mixing of these conditions only worsened the women's health. Germs passed back and forth with every encounter. Each client left something behind, whether visible or invisible, and the women had no chance to clear it away. The smell of disease became part of the air. Close conversation with the woman revealed breath that carried sourness and blood. No one mistook this for health, but no one intervened. Even when women could barely swallow because of swollen gums, they were sent back to work. Their bodies were treated as vessels for service, and their mouths were considered tools rather than living parts. If we compare this to today, it would be like dozens of patients forced to use the same dental equipment without cleaning, each one adding their own infection to the next. The absence of care meant that minor problems grew into major ones. A small sore became a deep ulcer. A loose tooth fell out, leaving gaps and pain. Jaw infection spread into the throat, making eating difficult. Yet no medical attention was given. Women worked through pain, unable to rest or heal. Their suffering was invisible to those who profited from them. Some tried to clean their mouths secretly. They dipped cloths into the same dirty water used for washing clothes or rags, swishing them between their lips. The water was foul, filled with soap remnants, sweat, and dirt. Instead of cleaning, it introduced more bacteria. Their attempts at self-care became another source of infection. The pain of oral disease extended beyond the mouth. It made eating difficult. Weakening bodies already starved of proper food. It spread into the throat, making speech painful. Some women stopped speaking outside of work, saving what little strength they had for clients. The silence deepened their isolation, leaving them unable to share their suffering even with one another. Brothel keepers dismissed complaints. A woman who said her gums bled was told to chew herbs. A woman who said she could not swallow was told to drink strong spirits. Alcohol was treated as a cure-all, burning through open wounds and leaving the mouth rawer than before. Perfume was sometimes sprayed directly into the mouth, another meaningless attempt at masking the odour. I cannot help but feel unsettled imagining women forced to smile through pain. While their mouths carried layers of infection no one cared to see, the long-term consequences were devastating. Teeth rotted and fell out. Gums receded until roots were exposed. Some women lost entire sets of teeth before reaching middle age, leaving their faces sunken and hollow. The shame of this damage was heavy, yet it made no difference to their work. As long as they could still serve clients, they were kept in the brothel. When they could not, they were discarded. The routine stripped away dignity as thoroughly as it stripped away health. To have no control over one's own mouth, to be denied even the chance to rinse with clean water, revealed the depth of neglect. The women carried infections day after day, year after year, until their bodies broke down completely. By then, there was no one left who would listen. The mouth was not a site of care, it was a site of neglect. It was not a source of nourishment, it was a tool of survival in a place that gave nothing back. The lips cracked daily, the gums bled constantly, the tongue carried infection endlessly, yet even worse waited on their fingertips. The same hands used to serve clients carried filth under nails, spreading disease in ways just as dangerous as unwashed mouths. Fingernails in Victorian brothels told their own story of neglect. They were rarely trimmed, jagged at the edges, and stained with layers of dirt that never left. Underneath lay bits of dried blood, skin, and soil gathered from daily survival. The nails split and peeled but were never cared for, because care required time and tools that these women did not have. Instead, they became sharp extensions of the hand, used for tasks both rough and intimate. Clients expected them to undress quickly, to scrape, to touch, to handle every detail of the encounter, no matter how filthy the nails themselves were. The women knew their nails carried disease. Each scratch left behind a mark, sometimes invisible, sometimes bleeding. Bacteria lived under the rough edges, ready to transfer into the skin. Cuts made by accident turned into sores. Clients, too drunk to care, allowed these nails across their bodies without thought. And so germs moved from one to another, spreading quietly, unnoticed until sickness arrived days later. It is almost grimly amusing that men feared disease in theory, but happily welcomed nails black with filth against their own flesh. The nails were never washed properly. At best, they were dipped in the same dirty basins used for laundry or bathing. The water itself was already filled with soap scum, hair, and sweat. dipping hands did nothing but add another layer of grime. Scraping beneath the nails was rare, and when it happened, it was done with broken combs or pins, tools that carried dirt themselves. No matter the effort, the filth remained. Clients sometimes requested that nails be used deliberately. They wanted the scraping of skin, the scratching across their backs, the roughness of touch. These actions, performed with nails already packed with dirt, left trails of bacteria behind. Cuts became infected easily. For the women, it was another way their bodies became instruments of harm, forced to play roles they never chose. The nails also became tools for clothing. Buttons stuck or laces tangled were undone with sharp tips. Garments soaked in sweat and fluids resisted, and the nails dug in deeper, breaking and tearing in the process. The jagged edges grew sharper still. Each break created another surface for dirt to lodge, another crevice for germs to hide. No one saw reason to provide proper grooming. Scissors, files, or soap were not given. To the brothel owners, nails mattered only as long as they did the job. A woman's health was not worth the cost of care. The result was a cycle of injury and infection. Each use of the hands created new risks, and each risk was ignored. The infection spread widely. A scratch across the skin near delicate areas could lead to swelling and pus. Women endured painful sores that made movement difficult. Clients, too, carried away infections unknowingly. The exchange became constant, flowing in every direction, unstoppable because it was unacknowledged. If we compare this to today, it would be like a surgeon operating with long, blackened nails, each one filled with dirt and blood, yet still being praised for precision. The appearance of the nails reflected exhaustion. Women looked at their hands and saw proof of the life they led. The cracks and dirt mirrored the cracks and dirt of the rooms around them. They might once have trimmed or polished in better days, but now the thought never came. Instead, the nails became another part of survival, ugly but necessary, ignored until they caused pain. Some women attempted to scrape the dirt away using knives or shards of pottery. These efforts often left their fingers bleeding. Still, the dirt returned quickly. With every mattress handled, with every rag washed, with every client touched, the filth built up again. There was no escaping it. The body was trapped in a loop of contamination. Brothel keepers ignored complaints. They laughed at the idea of women asking for grooming tools. To them, nails were simply another instrument of the trade. They saw no reason to spend money on small luxuries. A broken nail or a bleeding cut was nothing compared to the profits made. I cannot help but feel uneasy picturing a room of women scratching their heads, their clients, and themselves with the same nails that never once knew what true cleaning felt like. The nails became symbolic. They carried not only germs, but also the weight of neglect. They showed how little mattered in the daily routine. No one inspected them. No one tried to hide their filth. They were exposed openly, and another part of the brothel environment was accepted as normal. The cycle of scratching and infection never stopped. Nails broke, healed, and broke again. Cuts bled, scabbed, and reopened. Germs moved freely, invisible yet powerful. Life continued, wrapped in neglect that was never questioned. The hands were dirty, the nails were blackened, the infections were constant, and still. The women were told to cover the stench of their bodies with perfumes so cheap and harsh that they caused new wounds. The air inside Victorian brothels was heavy with layered smells. Sweat from long nights clung to every surface, mixing with the sour trace of fluids that stained the mattresses. The women themselves carried these odours on their skin and clothes. To hide them, they were handed bottles of cheap perfume diluted with alcohol. The liquid was sprayed over dresses and even onto their bodies, soaking into the same fabric that had not been washed for weeks. The result was not freshness, but a sharp, choking mix that clung to everyone in the room. The perfume was never meant to mask fully. It was used as a quick fix, sprayed between clients to create the illusion of change. A woman would lift her skirt slightly, splash the mixture across herself, and wait a moment for the burn to fade. The scent was strong, but it did not cover the deeper smells of sweat, discharge, or blood. It only added another layer to them. It is almost laughable that brothel owners thought a few drops of cheap perfume could erase years of filth baked into fabric and skin. The bottles were often shared. One was passed from hand to hand, the same liquid used by everyone. When the perfume ran low, water or spirits were added to stretch it further. The glass collected grime, and the nozzle clogged with residue. Still, it was treated as essential because appearance mattered more than comfort. A client might accept the sourness of perfume more readily than the natural smell of unwashed flesh. Even if the difference was slight, the effect on the skin was harsh. Alcohol dried it quickly, leaving it cracked and red. For women already irritated by rashes or sores, the sting was unbearable. Some woke at night,